But for me, they were looking deeper. The counselors that I saw, they were asking the right questions, but I wasn't giving the true.
Do you ever look at your life and wonder why you are the way you are, or how you got to where you are now? Maybe it's an easy answer for you. Maybe it's a question you don't want to know the answers to. Maybe the answers are complicated, messy, or painful, and looking back feels like more than you can handle. For me, it was the latter. I've been through so much, I feel I've lived several lives already, and each one has caused new emotional scars that continue to grow and change me. The thing that stood out was when you said, I've lived several lives already. Can you kind of go into what you're talking about there and what you mean by that?
Yeah, so after my mom and dad, well, and not even after they split up, I guess after they split up, that was kind of an end of one life. And then we had the period between after they split up to up until when my dad passed away. Then those two sections of my life, I felt like were shoved behind me and forgotten about. So there's two lives right there. Mm-hmm. And then my first marriage, things were vastly different in my first marriage than I've experienced the rest of my adult life. And I felt like when I left that chapter of my life behind, it was another life that just was completely different. Everything was different moving forward. And then the period before I found the redemption, before I kind of lost my way and pulled away from God for several years. That was a life that I never thought I would live. I never thought that I'd pull away from God. I never thought that I would go through the things I went through during those painful years. Mm-hmm. And then my life now. So there's just been, I guess, chapters more or less that seem like completely different lives that don't define who I am anymore.
Now, you were saying earlier about how, at one point you were exhausted. Did that play into that? Going back and feeling like each one of those, chapters were a lifetime. Did that play into that feeling?
Yeah, for sure. Because there's just there were things in each of those chapters of my life that I did push aside at the end of those and I didn't want to deal with. And I think a big part of me finding where I ended up at the end of this book was having to understand why I experienced the things the way that I did and why I made the choices that I did. And it was hard. It was a hard reality for me to look back and actually see about myself because I had to admit things about myself that I didn't want to admit, that I was ashamed to even admit to myself, let alone the world.
Mm-hmm. We didn't get too far, even past that before another question came up. So at this point, we're just in the first chapter, and it's called Reality. And in this part of the book, you talked about. It says, we were all good at pretending, at hiding reality. Mom and her bruises and scars. And I hid my ever-present stomach ache so no one would ever discover it was because of worry and fear. This is one thing that, and being a bus driver, like we have to go through courses and point these things out. But to me, I think one of the hardest thing is when we see children that go through this, and even in my children, when things are wrong with them physically, the first thing you want to do is you want to go to the doctor. And it's not until in situations like this, when all of those have been exhausted, then they go, okay, there's a deeper issue here. And I think a lot of times that these kind of experiences get overlooked because of that. Like they try to treat the issue without even knowing what the real issue is. Can you go into a little bit deeper about how that affected you and that part of your life?
Well, it was a different time then. Back then I feel like the word anxiety, and I think I talk about it in my book, the word anxiety was not something that was prevalent in society. Mm-hmm. So the fact that I bit my nails all the time, or I seemed super nervous or emotional, it probably didn't trigger any responses from people, at least not to my knowledge.
Mm-hmm.
And thinking back, maybe it did, because I guess I was called into the counselors to speak a couple times. So maybe the teachers did see some things. But like you said, nowadays, they would look at that and be like, all right, this kid has anxiety. Let's get her to the doctor and get her some medication to fix it. Nobody's going to look at why the child has anxiety. But for me, they were looking deeper. The counselors that I saw, they were asking the right questions, but I wasn't giving the true answers. So yeah, I think that's kind of what you're getting at, like the anxiety and how it felt as a kid. I was terrified, and I was terrified of everybody finding out the truth. So that in and of itself caused anxiety, not just the anxiety that I had about my fears at home. I was terrified of somebody else finding out what was happening in my home.
And I'm sure that has a lot to do with children nowadays. But like you said, a few years ago, we were told to keep our emotions to ourselves. And there wasn't any deeper probe. All that's just, what they are and what they're dealing with. And I think there's a lot of people that had a lot of great injustices because of the way things were treated like that. But again, like you said, you were hiding those things. So they were asking the right questions. And that is something that's hard to grasp for this type of situation. You want to help, but how do you help when you can't help? And the person you would wanted to be helped, but the shame that you were carrying on top of that wouldn't let you.
Yeah.
And that's a deep thing to be carrying, especially as a child.
Yeah. And it's like anybody who needs help, really. You can't help them until they realize they need help themselves, until they're willing to admit that they need help. And my mom and I were terrified to admit that. Terrified of what would happen if we did admit that. So there was nothing that any of those counselors could have done short of calling Child Protective Services and having me removed from the home, which I'm sure they knew probably wasn't the best solution either. So it's tough. It's tough when you see things like that as a bus driver or as a teacher, not being able to help those kids. I could not imagine being in a situation like that.